The rain was a fist, hammering against the thin glass of her living room window. Nora had been counting the seconds between the flash of lightning and the grumble of thunder, a childhood habit that died hard. 5 seconds, 5 miles. This one was close. The single lamp in the corner flickered once, twice, then surrendered to the storm. Darkness swallowed the room whole, absolute and immediate. It was the kind of thick, pressing dark that happened only in this part of the city, where the grid was old and resentful. She sighed, the sound loud in the sudden silence. It was just a blackout. Annoying, but not the end of the world. She knew where the candles were. She knew how to light the gas stove with a match. This was the texture of her life, a constant negotiation with things that were broken. However, the sound that came next was not the house settling or the wind rattling the frame. It was a solid, urgent knock on her front door. 3 heavy thuds that vibrated through the floorboards. Her breath caught. No one came to this door. Not at this hour, not in this weather. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She thought of the faulty lock, the one she kept meaning to ask the landlord to fix. She was just a woman in a house that was falling apart. But the knock came again, harder this time, a sound that held no patience. She had to answer. Peering through the peephole revealed nothing but a distorted, watery blackness. Taking a shaky breath, she pulled the door open just a crack, the safety chain still engaged. A man was slumped against the frame, his form a towering silhouette against the storm-swept street. Rain dripped from a head of dark hair plastered to his skull. His suit, impossibly fine, even soaked and ruined, clung to a broad frame. He lifted his head, and in the next flash of lightning, she saw his face. Carved, hard lines and eyes so dark they seemed to drink the light. And blood. A dark stain was spreading down his left sleeve from a gash on his upper arm. He did not speak. He simply watched her, his gaze intense, pinning her in place. It was not a request for help. It was a demand for sanctuary. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door, to pretend she was not home. He was danger, distilled and potent, delivered to her doorstep. But behind the cold authority in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something else. A deep, animal weariness. The look of a man who had been running for a very long time and could not run another step. Against every rational thought, she slid the chain free and pulled the door wide. She had just let the storm inside. He moved past her into the small foyer, bringing the smell of rain and cold iron with him. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing them in the suffocating darkness. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain and their 2 sets of breaths, one steady, the other ragged. Nora fumbled on the side table, her fingers finding the waxy cylinder of a candle and a book of matches. A moment later, a small, dancing flame pushed back the shadows, casting long, wavering shapes against the walls. In the candlelight, he was even more intimidating. He stood with an unnerving stillness in the center of her small living room, water pooling around his expensive leather shoes on her worn linoleum floor. He was a creature of onyx and steel, completely out of place amongst her second-hand furniture and stacks of library books. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He glanced down at his arm as if just noticing the wound. He gave a curt, dismissive nod. "It will manage." His voice was low and gravelly, an accent she couldn't quite place clinging to the edges of his words. "You should sit down." She gestured toward the lumpy armchair she'd gotten from a thrift store. He ignored it. His eyes swept the room, not with curiosity, but with a cold, tactical assessment. He was mapping exits, calculating angles, judging weaknesses. He was judging her. Nora felt a flush of shame for the peeling paint, the faint scent of mildew from the old walls. Then, a spark of anger. What right did he have? He was the one bleeding on her floor. She went to the bathroom and returned with a threadbare towel and her small first aid kit. She set them on the coffee table between them. "Here." He looked at the box, then at her. For a long moment he said nothing. He was deciding something. She could almost see the calculations turning behind his eyes. Finally, he reached out and took the towel, his movements economical and precise. He began to dry his face and hair, never taking his eyes off her. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. "I don't have much," she said, breaking the quiet. "But I can make coffee on the stove." A ghost of something. Not a smile, but a slight easing of the hard line of his mouth, appeared and vanished. Coffee would be good. In the kitchen, lit by another candle, she worked with practiced ease, her hands moving through the familiar motions of scooping grounds and filling the percolator. It was a small, domestic ritual that felt absurd under the weight of his presence. He stood in the doorway, watching her, a silent predator in the shadows. He dwarfed the frame, making her tiny kitchen feel like a cage. "You trust too easily," he said, his voice startling her. She looked up from the stove. "You needed help. People who need help are often the most dangerous. Are you dangerous?" The question was out before she could stop it. He didn't answer directly. "I am a man who has enemies." That much was obvious. The suit, the wound, the way he held himself like a loaded weapon. This was not some random victim of a mugging. This was something else entirely. She poured the steaming coffee into 2 mismatched mugs, her hands trembling slightly. She handed one to him, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. His skin was cold, but a shocking jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. He pulled his hand back as if burned. She took a sip of her own coffee, the familiar bitterness a small comfort. She needed to know. "Who are you?" He took a long swallow of the hot liquid before answering, his dark eyes fixed on her face over the rim of the mug. "My name is Marco." He offered nothing more. Just a name. Felt like a warning. As if on cue, the slow, heavy sweep of headlights cut through the rain-streaked window, crawling down her quiet street. Nora's heart leaped into her throat. Marco moved with a terrifying, silent speed. He was across the room in 2 strides, pulling the edge of the curtain back a millimeter. His body went rigid. "Get away from the window," he commanded, his voice a low hiss. She saw it then. A long, black sedan, moving at a funeral pace. Another one followed close behind. They weren't police cars. They were sleek, predatory, their windows tinted to an impenetrable black. They were hunting, and the man in her kitchen was the prey. Nora backed away from the window, her coffee mug rattling in its saucer on the counter. The simple act of kindness she thought she had performed had been a terrible mistake. She had not just offered a stranger shelter from the storm. She had chosen a side in a war she didn't understand, a war whose soldiers were now parked outside her front door. The old, faulty lock on her door felt as flimsy as paper. She was trapped, not just by the storm, but by the silent, bleeding man whose enemies were waiting in the dark. The black cars sat there for what felt like an eternity, their engines a low, menacing rumble beneath the sound of the rain. Marco remained by the window, a statue carved from shadow, his stillness more frightening than any overt threat. He was waiting. Nora found she couldn't breathe properly. Every creak of the old house sounded like a footstep on the porch. The world had shrunk to this small, candlelit room and the danger lurking just outside. Finally, with a soft splash of tires on wet asphalt, the cars moved on, their red taillights disappearing into the deluge. The immediate pressure lifted, but the air remained thick with menace. The blackout was no longer a simple inconvenience. It was a shroud, hiding them from the world, and hiding the world from them. Marco let the curtain fall back into place. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "They will be back." It wasn't a guess. It was a certainty. "What do they want?" she whispered. "They want me," he said simply. "And now, they will think you are with me." The implication hung in the air between them. Her life, the quiet, predictable, lonely life she had carved out for herself, had been irrevocably compromised. Fear was a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. She should have been screaming at him to get out, to take his war with him. But looking at him, she saw the exhaustion was still there, etched into the lines around his eyes. He was a wolf, yes, but a wounded one run to ground. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the house, making them both freeze. It was different from Marco's knock. This was official, measured. "Stay here," he breathed, his voice barely audible. He moved away from the door, melting into the deeper shadows of the hallway that led to the back of the house. "And say nothing." Nora's legs felt like lead, but she forced them to move. She crept to the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Through the peephole, she saw two large men in dark raincoats. They were not in uniform, but they had the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement or something trying to look like it. "Ma'am?" a voice called through the door. "We're checking on residents due to the blackout. Just want to make sure everyone's all right." It was a plausible lie. Plausible enough to be terrifying. She knew, with absolute certainty, that these were the men from the cars. She thought of Marco, hidden somewhere in the darkness of her home. Her choice was simple: open the door and give him up, or lie and tether herself to his fate. She took a deep breath, pressing her face close to the wood. "I'm fine," she called out, pitching her voice to sound sleepy and annoyed. "The power's out, that's all. You woke me up." There was a pause. She could feel them on the other side, considering. "We saw a light," the voice said, smoother now, probing. "Candles." "Yes, candles," she snapped, injecting a note of impatience. "What else am I supposed to use?" "Please, I'm trying to sleep." Another long silence. Nora held her breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the doorknob. She was a terrible liar. Surely they could hear the frantic pulse in her throat. "All right, ma'am. Sorry to have bothered you." She waited, not moving, until she heard their heavy footsteps retreat down the porch steps. Only then did she let out the breath she was holding, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and relief. She had done it. She had lied for him. Marco emerged from the hallway, his expression unchanged. But his eyes, when they met hers, held something new, a flicker of respect. He walked over to the armchair and finally sat down, the stiff fabric groaning under his weight. He looked at the first aid kit on the table. "You should see to that arm," she said, her voice raspy. This time he didn't argue. He picked up the box, his large hands clumsy with the small latches. He pulled out the antiseptic wipes and a roll of gauze. He worked methodically, his face a mask of concentration as he cleaned the gash on his arm. It was deep, a clean slice that must have bled profusely. He did it all with a detached efficiency, as if he were tending to a piece of machinery rather than his own body. She watched him, fascinated and horrified. This was a man accustomed to violence. It was written in the controlled precision of his movements, in the old, faded scar that traced his jawline, barely visible in the candlelight. "Thank you," he said, the words quiet but clear in the still room. He was looking at the bandage, not at her, but she knew the words were for her, for the lie she had told at the door. "They'll know I lied," she said, thinking out loud. "They saw the light. They'll be back." "Yes," he agreed, "but not tonight. They will wait. They will watch." He finally looked up, his gaze pinning her. "You are in danger because of me. I will not let them harm you." It was a promise, spoken with the weight of an oath. In his world, she was beginning to understand, words like that were currency. They were debts. He owed her now, and a man like Marco always paid his debts. The thought was not as comforting as it should have been. It felt like another link in a chain being forged around her. The long night wore on. The rain softened to a drizzle. The candles burned low. They did not speak much more. There was nothing to say. They were two strangers from different worlds, trapped together by a storm and a threat that still lingered outside. Nora eventually dozed off in the lumpy armchair, exhaustion winning out over fear. When she woke, stiff and cold, the first gray light of dawn was filtering through the window. Marco was gone from the chair. For a wild, panicked moment, she thought he had left, slipped away in the night, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Then she saw him, He was standing by the window, looking out at the rain-washed street. He had not slept. He had been watching over her, protecting her. As the city slowly came to life, the familiar sounds of morning traffic a distant hum, the power suddenly surged back on. The lamp in the corner flickered to life with a buzz. The refrigerator in the kitchen began to hum. The sudden return to normalcy was jarring. The night, with its shadows and secrets, felt like a dream. But Marco was still there, solid and real, a dark piece of the night that refused to fade with the daylight. His phone, a sleek, severe-looking device she hadn't seen before, buzzed in his pocket. He answered it, turning away from her slightly as he spoke in low, rapid tones. She couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear from his tone. Authority, command. He was giving orders. He was in control. He ended the call and turned back to her. "It is done. They are gone." "Just like that?" she asked, incredulous. Just like that. The threat had been handled. The war had moved on. He was safe. He could leave. And she could have her broken, messy life back. The relief she expected to feel was absent, replaced by a strange hollowness. Her own phone, sitting on the kitchen counter, began to ring shrilly. It was Mrs. Davenport, the wealthy woman whose sprawling, sterile house she cleaned 3 times a week. Nora answered, bracing herself. "Where are you?" the woman's voice screeched, devoid of any preamble. "You were supposed to be here an hour ago. Do you have any idea how much I rely on you?" "There was a blackout," Nora started to explain. "The whole neighborhood." "I don't pay you for excuses," Mrs. Davenport cut her off. "If you're not here in 30 minutes, don't bother coming back at all." Nora looked at the phone in her hand, at the life of scrubbing another woman's floors and being treated like a piece of furniture. Then she looked at Marco, who was watching her, his face impassive. She had faced down men with guns at her door last night. She had survived a night of terror, and in doing so, she had found a sliver of something hard and unbreakable within herself. "I quit," Nora said, the words quiet but firm. She ended the call before the woman could respond, dropping the phone onto the counter with a clatter. The action felt monumental, like cutting the last rope that tied her to shore. Marco raised an eyebrow. He reached into the inside pocket of his ruined suit jacket and pulled out a thick roll of cash bound by a simple rubber band. He peeled off several bills and held them out to her. For the trouble. It was more money than she made in a month. Enough to fix the lock, to pay the back rent, to breathe for a few weeks. It was a transaction. Payment for services rendered. Nora looked at the money, then at his face. She shook her head. "I didn't do it for money," she said. His hand remained outstretched, the offer hanging in the air. He seemed genuinely confused. "Then why?" "Because you needed help?" she repeated. The answer as simple and as complicated as it had been last night. He slowly withdrew his hand, studying her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. "No one," he said, his voice low, "has ever done anything for me without a price." He said her name then, for the first time since he'd told her his. Nora, it sounded different from his lips. Not a name but a discovery. An admission of something he couldn't yet define. The silence that followed was more charged than any of their whispered words in the dark. It was a confession of its own. A soft thud on her front porch broke the spell. Marco was instantly alert, his body tensing. He motioned for her to stay put as he moved to the door, peering through the peephole. He was still for a long moment before he unlocked it and stepped outside. When he came back in, he was holding a small, dead sparrow in his palm. "A message," he said, his voice cold as ice. "From who?" she whispered, her stomach turning. "The men from last night. They know you helped me. They know where you live." He looked from the bird to her, his dark eyes blazing with a protective fire. "Your life here is over. You are not safe anymore. You have to come with me." He was not asking. He was telling her. This was the price. Not the money he had offered, but this. The complete and total destruction of her world. She thought about her small house, her books, the quiet anonymity of her existence. It was all gone. She looked at the dead bird, a symbol of a world she had never wanted to be a part of. Then she looked at Marco. He was danger and he was death, but last night he had also been her shield. She gave a single, sharp nod. Leaving her house was a blur. She packed a small bag with essentials, her hands moving on autopilot. Every object she touched felt like a relic from a past life. The chipped mug, the worn paperback, the faded photograph of her parents. They belonged to a woman who no longer existed. Marco waited by the door, his presence filling the small space, a silent, impatient guardian. When she was ready, he led her outside. A sleek, black car, different from the ones last night but no less intimidating, was idling at the curb. A man in a dark suit stood by the rear door, holding it open. He nodded respectfully to Marco, his eyes sliding over Nora with a brief, dismissive glance before looking away. She was invisible again, but in a different way. She was not a person. She was cargo. As she got into the car, the scent of rich leather and his cologne, something clean and sharp, like cedarwood, enveloped her. It was the scent of power, of a world so far removed from her own it might as well have been another planet. She looked back at her little house, the paint peeling, a testament to a life of just getting by. She had believed this was temporary, a short-term arrangement until he dealt with the threat, a way to stay safe. But as the car pulled away from the curb and her old life shrank in the rearview mirror, she caught the look in his eyes as he watched her. It was not the look of a man offering temporary shelter. It was the possessive, unyielding look of a man who had just claimed something he had no intention of ever letting go. She had not been rescued. She had been acquired. The city became a smear of glass and steel outside the tinted windows. They drove in silence, the quiet in the car a heavy, suffocating blanket. Nora stared out at the world passing by, feeling like a ghost. The man driving never spoke. Marco sat beside her, a bastion of stillness, his presence a constant, unnerving pressure against her side. He was not looking at the city. He was watching her. She could feel the weight of his gaze, assessing, measuring. They arrived at a sleek, modern skyscraper that pierced the clouds, a monument of wealth and power. In a private elevator, they ascended in silence, the ride so smooth she felt no sense of motion, only a growing pressure in her ears. The doors opened directly into a sprawling penthouse apartment. The space was immense, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking, panoramic view of the entire city. It was decorated in stark, minimalist shades of black, white, and gray. It was less a home than a fortress, beautiful, cold, and utterly impersonal. There was no clutter, no sign of a life lived, only expensive art and designer furniture arranged with surgical precision. "You will be safe here," Marco said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "No one can get to you." She walked to the window, drawn by the view. The city was laid out below her like a map. From up here, her little neighborhood was an insignificant smudge, lost in the urban sprawl. It was a God's-eye view, the perspective of a man who looked down on the world and saw only territory to be controlled. Over the next few days, Nora learned the rhythm of this new life. It was a life of luxurious confinement. She had everything she could possibly want: food, clothes, books, all appearing as if by magic, delivered by silent staff who never met her eye. But she could not leave. The elevator required a keycard and a code. The doors were always locked. She was a bird in a very gilded cage. Marco was a phantom presence. He would be gone for long stretches, then reappear without warning, often late at night. He would stand in the doorway of the living room where she sat reading, watching her for a few moments before disappearing into his own wing of the apartment. They rarely spoke. The silence between them was a living thing, filled with everything they could not say. She was his responsibility, his debt, his prisoner. One evening, he came home later than usual. There was a new tension in his shoulders, a darker shadow in his eyes. He poured himself a drink at the bar, his back to her. "His name is Silvio," Marco said, without turning around. The man who is hunting me. We grew up together. I thought of him as a brother. The words were clipped, tight with a betrayal that was still a fresh wound. This was his vulnerability, the core of the violence that had spilled onto her doorstep. A betrayal by someone he had trusted. He believes my father promised him territory that was given to me, Marco continued, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He thinks I stole his birthright. Now he wants to take everything. He finally turned, his eyes locking on hers. Including you. He sent the bird as a message. To show me that he can touch what is mine. What is mine? The words sent a chill down her spine. A strange, terrifying thrill. He was not just protecting her out of a sense of duty. It had become personal. Silvio had made her a symbol, a piece on the board. And in doing so, he had fundamentally changed the game. The confrontation, when it came, was not what she expected. There was no shootout, no dramatic standoff in a warehouse. It was far more insidious. A message arrived for Marco. Silvio had a proposition. A meeting. He named a place. A small, unassuming Italian restaurant in her old neighborhood. And he made one condition. Marco had to bring Nora. It's a trap, she said immediately, her heart pounding. Of course it is, Marco agreed, his face grim. But it is one I must walk into. He has made you the prize. To refuse is to show weakness. It is to tell him that you are my weakness. Then I'll be your strength, she said, the words surprising her as much as they did him. She looked around the cold, empty apartment. This was not a life. It was a waiting room. She was tired of waiting. He thinks I'm just some woman you picked up. Piece of property. He doesn't know me. A plan, desperate and half-formed, began to take shape in her mind. That restaurant, I know it. I used to clean the bakery next door. I know the back alleys. I know the people. Marco watched her, a strange light dawning in his eyes. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time since that night in the storm. Not as a victim or a liability, but as an asset. A weapon he didn't know he possessed. The restaurant was a cliché of checkered tablecloths and dripping candles. Silvio was waiting for them at a table in the back. A man with a politician's smile and a shark's dead eyes. His men were everywhere, pretending to be diners, their jackets bulging in all the wrong places. The air was thick with tension. Nora sat beside Marco, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She felt strangely detached, as if she were watching a movie. Silvio directed all his conversation to Marco, dismissing her with his eyes. This was his mistake. He was so focused on the king, he never saw the pawn moving across the board. As they talked, Nora excused herself to the restroom. She didn't go there. Instead, she slipped through the kitchen, a place she knew from her past life. The smells of garlic and tomato sauce were familiar, comforting. She moved with quiet confidence, just another working woman who belonged in the background. No one gave her a second look. Out the back door into the wet, grimy alley. She knew exactly where the bakery's main gas line was. She also knew that the old proprietor was careless about the emergency shut-off valve. She didn't shut it off. She opened it slightly, just enough for the smell to become noticeable, and then she pulled the fire alarm hidden in the alleyway for kitchen fires. Chaos erupted. The shrill clang of the alarm shattered the restaurant's tense quiet. People started shouting, scrambling for the exits. In the confusion, Marco's men moved. Silvio's men were disoriented. Their focus split. It was the opening Marco needed. Nora slipped back into the restaurant through the panicked crowd. She saw Marco, a blur of deadly motion, disarming one of Silvio's men. She saw Silvio, his face a mask of fury, realizing he had been outmaneuvered. He lunged for her, his one remaining trump card. But Marco was faster. He intercepted the move, and the confrontation was over in a brutal, silent instant. In the aftermath, standing in the rain-slicked alley behind the emptying restaurant, the sound of sirens growing closer, Marco turned to her. There was no one else around. Just them. The city lights cast a halo around his dark form. You saved my life, he said. It was not a thank you. It was a statement of fact. Debts are paid, she replied, her voice shaking slightly. He stepped closer, closing the space between them. He raised a hand and gently brushed a stray strand of rain-dampened hair from her face. His touch was feather-light, yet it burned a trail across her skin. A life saved is a life owed, he said, his voice a low growl. You saved mine that night in the storm. Tonight, you saved it again. His dark eyes held hers, and the mask of the cold, untouchable boss was completely gone. She saw only the man. Your life is not owed to me, Nora. It is bound to me. It was not a declaration of love. It was something deeper, more dangerous, and infinitely more real. It was an acknowledgement of an unbreakable bond, forged in darkness and sealed in violence. This was his world, and this was his oath. They returned not to the cold penthouse, but to a different place. A brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined street. A home that felt lived in, filled with dark wood and worn leather. A fire was burning in the hearth. It was his real home, his sanctuary. He led her to the window, which looked out onto a quiet garden. He stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching. The silence between them was different now. It was not empty, it was full. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single old-fashioned brass key. He pressed it into her palm, his fingers closing hers around it. It's the key to your house, he said softly. I had my men secure it. The back rent is paid for the next year. It's safe. Everything is taken care of. You can go back. You are free to go. He was giving her a choice. The one thing no one in his world ever had. The one thing he had taken from her. She looked down at the key, its metal cool against her skin. She could take it. She could walk out the door and reclaim a semblance of her old life. She could be Nora, the woman who lived in the small, broken house, forever looking over her shoulder. Where she could stay. She looked up from the key to his face. He was watching her, his expression guarded, waiting for her decision. The firelight danced in his dark eyes. She saw the storm in him, the danger, the darkness. But she also saw the man who had stood watch over her while she slept. The man who had shown her a strength she never knew she possessed. Slowly, deliberately, she closed her hand around the key, the metal warming to her touch. She did not say a word. She did not have to. Her choice was made, not in words, but in the quiet, steady beat of her heart. She was not going back. She was already home.